Hello, welcome back to the third video in our series, Protecting Your Certificate, presented jointly by the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association and the Federal Aviation Administration. I am Eric Blinderman, and again, pleased to be joined by Jamal Wilson of the FAA, Don Riley of the FAA, and Ian Arndt of AOPA. This third segment is about posting, not just carrying passengers or cargo, but carrying cameras and using them. Pilots should be aware that anything in the public view, including video, photos, social media posts, may be viewed by the FAA and used in enforcement actions. There are also guardrails when posting online a request for help or advertising that you have an open seat on an upcoming trip. There's a lot to consider before just simply hitting click and making that post. Again, for each of these videos, we're going to use a real-life scenario and a question that AOPA heard through its Pilot Information Center. So let's dive in. Jamal?
Yeah, Eric, the first question that we get asked is, if I post something online about my flying, can that be used against me in some way? Don, could you offer any insight on that?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I will say, if you're going to post something online about your flying, don't do something careless. Don't do something reckless. Obviously, this is coming from the FAA, right? You don't want to do that and then post it online. First of all, you shouldn't be flying that way, careless or reckless. And then you definitely shouldn't post it, because the answer is yes. We can use that video evidence in any kind of NTSB or other hearing. Ian?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. For sure, by and large, any video that's acquired by the FAA or any, frankly, law enforcement as well, could potentially be used as evidence against you. So, in addition to ensuring that you're not flying carelessly and recklessly, you want to make sure you look at your videos and your content and to ensure that there are no issues. The operation itself needs to be fine. No flight below minimum safe altitude, no careless or reckless operation. We also need to consider the flight sharing or the time building and the cost sharing examples that we discussed previously. The short is that the entire flight needs to be squeaky clean before you go ahead and post anything, because it can and it will be used against you if the FAA potentially finds out about it and there's an issue on there. And then also consider that the FAA is going to investigate complaints very seriously. They take complaints levied against pilots, FAR violations, very seriously. Even if your video doesn't have a particular, even if you're very confident that your flight was legal, even if the video doesn't necessarily show anything illegal occurred or in violation of the rules, if somebody does complain against you, the FAA is going to investigate it, and your video is always going to be Exhibit A.
Yeah, I would agree. If in doubt, don't do it. Make sure you're safe and legal. And if you have a question, please reach out in advance. It's way better to be proactive and get your questions answered before something happens.
So in an incident or an accident, the FAA and the NTSB will investigate. They'll look at all resources that they can. Something hasn't been posted, but it can still be on your camera. For what you have recorded and not yet posted, is that evidence that can be used?
Yeah, so certainly if it's a recording and you made it and the FAA can get their hands on it, then yes, it's something that could be used against you. Now, we do see a lot of videos on YouTube from content creators and Instagram and other social media platforms that are heavily edited, right? And so part and parcel to what the FAA would be looking at in those cases is not only the actual video that's been posted and whether or not that demonstrates any FAR violations, but the raw footage as well, which shows the whole flight. They're going to look at everything that they can. Keep in mind that the FAA does have subpoena power and can, even in the absence of an enforcement action, can demand that information be produced in certain circumstances. Also keep in mind that, criminal penalties can be associated with a lot of stuff. We have a pretty recent example in the case of the Trevor Jacob incident where it was determined that he bailed out of an aircraft, or he caused an engine to fail intentionally and then purposefully bailed out of an aircraft with a parachute on board. In that particular instance, of course, his video was was used heavily in the FAA enforcement action, which ultimately resulted in revocation of his pilot certificate for careless or reckless operation.
Right.
But it's also important to remember that the Department of Justice prosecuted him for a charge related to obstruction with a federal investigation. He recently pleaded guilty to that, is now subject to a maximum of 20 years in a federal prison.
Yeah, all good points. And I will go back to photos or videos, and you mentioned about sometimes they're edited online. We would have to authenticate those videos, so we're not going to take anything at face value too. We'll have to make sure those videos or pictures are legitimate in our investigation.
So it sounds like the onus is on each operator to think very carefully about what they film and when they film to make sure that everything is above board for the purpose of possible enforcement action in those instances. Is that a good read?
Yeah, I would certainly think that's a good read. Yeah, so not only do you have to make sure that your video is totally fine, not evidence the violation, but the actual operation that you conducted doesn't show any violations either, because like we mentioned, that raw footage, if the FAA gets their hands on that and that demonstrates a violation, it may become an issue.
But to Don's point, safe operation is the first priority. Whether you're filming or not, if you're staying safe, if you're staying legal, then you really should have nothing to worry about.
Right.
Sounds good, Eric.
So the second point about posting, not just content, but posting before your flight, using social media, using some of the online networks to advertise the fact that you may have a seat open and I'm flying somewhere, I'm going to the Super Bowl, I have 3 seats. Am I going to charge you pro rata? Or somebody posts online, I'd like to get to this place. Does anybody have an airplane that I can appropriately buy a seat on? What about those cases?
I'll take a stab. Really, what you're referring to at the FAA, we call it holding out, okay? In essence, advertising, okay? I'm going to go back to Advisory Circular 61-142. Again, it has a great section that talks about holding out, what it is, how it can get you into trouble, how you might be able to do it with a defined group of people that you normally have a relationship with. And all that's in the context, right, of the expense sharing that goes on. So this is coming from the FAA again. Cost sharing is compensation, right? So you meet some of the elements already of becoming what we say a common carrier, flights from transportation from place to place for compensation. You meet those 3 elements already even with cost sharing. The problem is if you advertise that, if you hold out to do this, that could really get you into trouble. So you got to be careful what you post. And I just recommend you go read that advisory circular, the section on holding out. I don't know. Ian, what do you think?
Yeah, no, that was a good recap of it. I guess just to clarify what the holding out is, it's holding out as a willingness to transport people from point A to point B for compensation or higher. So a willingness to transport the public generally is sort of the issue. Just as a clarification's sake, again, there's plenty of resources available at the FAA's website, AOPA's website, which discuss these topics a little bit more specifically. Then as it relates to holding out, there is something that I like to refer to as the bulletin board exception to the rule. So there's generally advertising to transport people for compensation or higher, even in a cost sharing case, is not allowed. The bulletin board exception to this rule really says that it's okay for you to advertise an open seat or let other people know of an open seat if the audience is limited enough and that you're not holding out to the general public of the willingness to transport compensation or higher. I'd refer people back to that advisory circulars, the 61-142. On the discussion of holding out, there's several examples of what a limited advertising scenario would be okay. I think one of the examples that they specifically mention is at an FBO where you to physically pin something up onto a bulletin board, letting people know that you have a seat open that may be okay. Another hypothetical, particularly since we're talking about online posting, is that if you're limited, if the audience and the people who are actually able to see the posting is limited enough, it may be okay. Now, again, it's very, very difficult to do so in an online environment.
Yeah, I would say that you have to be really careful, because once you post something online, you don't necessarily know if it might reach a wider segment of the public, and then it's going to fall into holding out to the public. So you've got to be really careful. Again, I've mentioned it, Ian's mentioned it, Advisory Circular 61-142, a big section. It's paragraph 10 on holding out. Go there and look at how it explains it, how to avoid the trap of becoming, of holding out to the general public, which could get you into trouble. So just wanted to reiterate that.
I'm sorry, I'm glad you're saying that. If we're talking about the common purpose in this segment and earlier segments, as we're talking about the online presence. So, for example, if somebody were to go on Facebook and say, I'm going to the beach, and it's just me, and you're talking to just your friends, which is essentially a closed group in your friends network, that sounds like it would be okay. But if you start receiving hits from people way outside of your friends list, then now it sounds like we're approaching the bounds where it's compensation versus talking to that tighter list that we're talking about. Is that an accurate assessment?
Be careful, though. The advisory circular really speaks to that, talks about a defined group of people with which you have a prior relationship to, really narrows it down. So I don't know how many friends people have on Facebook these days, but if it's 400 or 500, that may not be a defined group, of people you have a prior relationship with. You just have to be careful, right, on the holding out and putting your flights that you're going to be flying out on the web. Could get in trouble. I don't know, Ian.
Yeah, I would agree. I think, you do have to be very, very careful. Again, once it's online, it's the difficult thing with online posting, again, is there's not a way to limit, once you post something, there may not be a good way to limit how many people actually have access to that or how many people could potentially respond to it. So really, best practice would be if you have to post something online, which I don't generally recommend, do so in a private group that general members don't have access to, with whom you have a prior relationship that's not open to everybody. Then you actually raise a good point there too, Jamal, about the common purpose associated with these types of flights. Again, we're talking about cost sharing and flying with passengers. Is there going to be a common purpose if a pilot were to post an open seat on a flight? And the answer to that is, by and large, yes, there probably will be a common purpose. The pilot's posting him going from point A to point B already. It's already a predetermined destination for the pilot. So the joining of passengers wouldn't necessarily run afoul of the rule.
Ian, Don, Jamal, thank you again for another excellent video discussion, and for the series on protecting your certificate, brought to you by AOPA and the FAA. I hope that this series gave pilots a sense of questions that you should be asking yourself before you fly with property, passengers, and content. And for those watching at home, thank you very much.